One more time. Gentlemen and ladies. Now, I realize that that's the opposite of what you're used to hearing. We always hear that ladies and gentlemen, but we're into human relations now. So, gentlemen and ladies, I'd like to welcome you here this evening and encourage you to complete your meal noisily or quietly, whichever way you prefer. But we would like to get underway this evening. I'm Tom Budnick, and on behalf of the Iowa State University chapter of Phi Delta Kappa, I'd like to welcome you here this evening. This is our meeting. We don't really care about the rest of you groups that are here tonight. Well, to be legal, we have to officially call this meeting to order as an official Phi Delta Kappa meeting. We need 6 a year, and this is number 2. So we are here as a Phi Delta Kappa group, but of course we're a much more enriched group this evening because we have so many other people with us, and we really appreciate that enrichment, and we welcome your involvement tonight and appreciate the nice turnout that the entire conference has really had. This is the first time that I've ever done this, and you'll know, as we move along that this is the first time that I've ever done this. I have some introductions to make, and you always have to have some introductions. That enables you to finish your dessert. You may have noticed that at this head table, males are in the minority. We even have some invisible minorities here. I'm a Polish American, as many of you in this audience know, and I will not listen to any jokes later, even if Lou has 7 of them that he wants to tell me. Seriously, I would like to introduce the people at the head table. And I will start on my right, your left. On my far right is Joe Kiley. And Joe Kiley is steering committee representative for the Iowa Career Education Association. And I'm sure that many of you know that Joe is the Iowa Department of Public Instruction Career Ed Coordinator and Consultant. Next to her is a lady that I've just met this evening, Roberta Stauffer, who is President-elect of IEMA, the Iowa Educational Media Association. And Roberta is librarian at Eagle Grove High School. And next to her is an old friend of mine. Oh. Long time, that's right. I told you it was my first time. Betty Atwood is one of the neat people that I have met in my life. And I think that I have met many, but she ranks way up there. Betty is president of the IASCD, Iowa Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. And in her spare time, she works as curriculum coordinator at the Heartland Area Education Agency, number 11. Now, if you'd like me to tell you about Heartland Education Agency, no, okay, we won't go into that right now. On my left, your right, is Jan Barron, and Jan Barron is Vice President of the Iowa State University Chapter PDK, and as such, she is our program chairperson. Jan? And Jan is Assistant Professor at Iowa State University in Physical Education. And I'm going to skip over the fellow that you really aren't noticing right now. And I'm going to move to Mary Sterling. Mary and I have been known to have a drink or two together. I guess that's why I was able to follow in her footsteps. Mary is the immediate past president of the Iowa State University PDK chapter. And Mary is what you might know as a go-getter. When we were involved in this conference at the early days, and we were talking about the possibility of seeking out a PDK fastback author. Mary's one of these people who isn't about to just write a letter or make a telephone call. She really goes right out there and gets them, so she took a trip to Bloomington and ensured that we would have a fine speaker for tonight. So, Mary? And Mary is a media specialist at Ames Central Junior High School, a place where I spent a few years. I did spend a few years there. Okay.
And open house tomorrow.
Oh, open house tomorrow at Ames Central Junior High School. Okay. Integrated shelving. That's a plug. Well, it is a multicultural, ethnic, And now on to our speaker for the evening, James A. Banks. That sounds very formal. He's not really a very formal person. I really enjoyed the ride up from Des Moines the other day. And one of the first things I asked Jim as we were riding through downtown Des Moines was, I knew he was from Seattle, and I said, "Are you a native Seattle Washingtonian?" And he said, No, I'm a transplant. And I said, "Well, where are you from, Jim?" And he said, I'm originally from Chicago, and I did my undergraduate work at a school, maybe you don't know about it, it's a Chicago Teachers College. And Jim is one of two people that know of the existence of Chicago Teachers College, because I also graduated from Chicago Teachers College, and that gave us some instant rapport. And then we went on with our conversation, and I said, where did you do your graduate work? And he said, well, I did my graduate work at Michigan State University. And I said, well, I did my graduate work at Michigan State University. Well, to make a long story short, we talked about the fact that we knew where Spartan Village was and where Owen Hall was and various kinds of places like that on campus. And I really had a good feel for the fact that, we were kind of buddies rather than just strangers who happened to be thrust together. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Jim. He is a former elementary school teacher, and as many of you experienced today in his session, you know that he is a specialist in social studies and ethnic studies. I had my first article published this year, and then I looked over Jim's credentials, and it said, written over 70 professional articles in journals like the Kaplan, Harvard Educational Review, Social Studies, Ed Leadership, Ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I am 40 years old. You'd never know it, would you? And I thought, well, that's 1 in 40 years. I'll be an old man before I hit that 70. No, not 70 years, 70 articles. He has, as some of you know, contributed to several books and reviews. And if you're a regular Kaplan reader, He was guest editor in January of 1972 in a captain that focused on the imperatives of ethnic education. He was chairperson and senior author of a task force authoring the curriculum guidelines for multi-ethnic education. And this, of course, was a National Council of Social Studies position statement that was made several years ago. He did edit a yearbook for the National Council of Social Studies entitled Teaching Ethnic Studies, Concepts and Strategies. And then, you know, I told you about those 70 articles. Well, 8 books we have on top of that. And I told him today that he was such a baby because, you know, he's so much younger than I am, I think. I'm not really sure. I think he is. But just to name a few, and, you know, maybe these are some of the ones that you've seen. Teaching Strategies for Ethnic Studies, Teaching Strategies for Social Studies, Teaching Social Studies to Culturally Different Children, Teaching the Black Experience, the Black Self-Concept, Implications for Education and Social Science. And he did a history of Black Americans, just to name a few. In 1973, he was a Spencer Fellow for the National Academy of Education. And in 1975, he was an HEW appointee to the National Advisory Council on Ethnic Heritage Studies for the U.S. Office of Education. And in between time, he managed to do some studies in multi-ethnic programs in several foreign countries. Jim has talked to us about his family. He has 2 very gorgeous girls, and I imagine his wife is equally as gorgeous. But he's been a real neat person to get to know, and I know that you're going to enjoy having him with us tonight. Let's give a real nice round of applause for Jim Banks.
My wife, thanks Tom for the kind introduction. My wife told me to be sure and bring a suit because I was on the road for a week, which Tom didn't mention. As part of this Phi Delta Kappa lecture series, she said at a banquet you have to wear a suit. But now that I've appeared, I'm going to pull off my coat. It's good to be in Iowa, and this ends a long week for me, so I'm especially glad to be here because this is my last lecture stop. And then I go home tomorrow morning. Tom mentioned that I had gone to Chicago Teachers College. Maybe I forgot to tell him that in 1860 I left the South in search of the dream. I'm still searching. If you know where it went, let me know. I'd like to share, and I'm going to gauge my speech by the time. Having been a 5th grade teacher for a number of years, I know that humans have limitations in how long they can listen. So I'll try to gauge it in a reasonable time, so that means that I will be going to various places. I also have a coordinator of AV over here, and I hope we get our numbers and sequences straight. Events within the last decade have dramatically indicated that we live in a world society and that the social, economic, and political problems which the world faces are tremendous. In the future, even more than today, our students will be living in what Lester Brown has perceptively called a world without borders. The demands of the final decades of this century dictate that we educate a new kind of citizen, one who is active rather than passive, who seriously questions rather than passively accepts, and who is cosmopolitan rather than ethnocentric and culturally encapsulated. Planet Earth and its inhabitants will be seriously imperiled if the various peoples who inhabit it do not jointly solve their momentous problems within the next few decades. To function effectively within a world community of the future, students must develop ethnic tolerance, ethnic literacy, and pan-humanism. To help them do that, we must drastically modify the curriculum in the nation's schools. The current school curriculum throughout North America and in other parts of the world is not helping most of our students to prepare to function effectively within a world community of the future. Many of our students grow up within all-white middle-class communities and attend all-white middle-class schools. Their world is very different from the world society in which they will be required to function in the future. And what are some demographic characteristics of this emerging world society? The white race is a world minority. 5 out of 6 persons in the world are non-white, and most peoples in the world are non-Christian. And because the birth rate of non-whites greatly exceeds that of whites, white Christians will be an even smaller world minority by the year 2000. White Christians are also becoming less economically and politically powerful in the world community. The world's energy crisis has made this abundantly clear. Our nation, according to the Harvard sociologist Daniel Bell, is experiencing an identity crisis. Bell writes that the Western world dominated in the industrial society and the industrial world. But in his seminal book called The Coming of the Post-Industrial Society, Bell suggests that the West will not necessarily dominate the post-industrial world society that we are now entering. The West, according to Bell, is exhausted. It's facing an identity crisis. We cannot go on teaching our students that we are the greatest and that we are the best, but rather we must help them become sharers in decision-making with people who are non-white, with people who are different culturally. Wherever they go in the world, they will experience people from various racial and ethnic groups, and they must learn how to sit down at the bargaining table with folks who are ethnically and culturally different. When I was in London last spring, my next door, the people in the apartment above me were Arabs. The Arabs are also buying up much of Beverly Hills, and you can't get away from differences in this world society. However, the school curriculum usually reinforces the culture of Anglo-Americans and has largely excluded the cultures of other American ethnic groups. Clearly, this type of schooling cannot prepare students to function successfully within a predominantly non-white, non-Christian world of the present and future. Multi-ethnic education should be viewed as a process of curriculum reform that will liberate the hearts and minds of our students and help prepare them to function effectively within and across different ethnic cultures. I'd like to suggest, and my friend Carlos Cortez will be speaking to you tomorrow, and Carlos and I have written about the fact that often the curriculum has been taught from primarily an Anglo-centric perspective and also from a unilinear perspective. Overhead 1, please. In this overhead, I've tried to indicate how when we teach American history and American literature, often the experiences of North America is written as the history of European immigrants, and that ethnics are brought in only when they become a problem for the movement of the Europeans across the continent or when they get in the way of the Europeans. Let me give you a couple examples. For example, usually often textbooks will start the history of the Americas with Europe, and then they will follow the European immigrants. For example, Indians come in various points when they get in the way of the European immigrants. For example, in the 1830s, the Indians are discussed when they are moved to Indian territory. Mexican Americans are not usually studied until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848. This is the treaty, you may recall, in which Mexico surrendered half of its northern territory. Chinese Americans aren't usually discussed until 1882 when they build the railroad. The point I'm trying to make is that, and then we look at the history of the Americas as the movement of Anglos across the continent with other groups being brought in as minor themes. And this conceptualization of the development of America may be called Anglo-American centric and unilinear. Overhead 2, please. In this overhead, I try to give an alternative to viewing the development of the Americas, where you see various influences simultaneously. Rather than starting with Europe, or rather than starting with the European explorers of the 15th century, we could start with the Asian immigrants that came over the Bering Straits nearly 30,000 years ago. These Asian immigrants, we now believe, were hunters. They all didn't come at the same time, incidentally. Not all thousands of them came across the Bering Strait at once, but we think that the first groups began to come about 30,000 years ago, and they spread throughout the Americas. And also, we could look at influences from Mexico. For example, that were here long before the Europeans, the English came. For example, if you were studying the colonial period, you could look at the colony of New Mexico, which was formed prior to Jamestown. Also, you could look at various groups within colonial New Mexico, including the Indians, the mestizos, and blacks, and so forth. Also, you could look simultaneously at influences from Africa. And of course, you would look at influences from Europe. That then is a multi-dimensional, multi-ethnic perspective on American society, and that's the perspective I'm advocating. You can turn that off. I would like to discuss several notions which people have about ethnic studies and several problems with these notions. And I found these in several nations. I found them in Great Britain when you talk about teaching about Jamaicans. I found them in Canada when you talk about teaching about the various immigrant groups there from India and Pakistan. So these are pervasive assumptions that I have found about ethnic studies. And I'm going to criticize each of these assumptions, and then I'm going to end by suggesting what I think are alternative conceptions of ethnic studies. One of the assumptions is what I call the us and them assumption, the us and them. And that is, many people believe that ethnic studies is the study of them, and that American studies is the study of us. There are several problems with the us and them approach to ethnic studies. Number one, this conception of ethnic studies does not reflect the sociological definition of an ethnic group. Social scientists define an ethnic group as a group which shares a common ancestry, culture, history, tradition, sense of peoplehood, and which is a political and economic interest groups. So that means that we are all members of ethnic groups, whether we are Polish American, Afro-American, Mexican American, or Jewish American. You may say, well, I'm half English, 1/4 Polish, and 1/4 Jewish. What am I ethnically? It seems to me we must distinguish biological heritage from ethnicity. Ethnicity is primarily a cultural notion. So even though you may be half English, half Jewish, and half Polish, ethnically or culturally, you may be Anglo-American. We are all members of an ethnic group. That means then that when we study ethnic studies, we study all of us and not just them, the oppressed ethnics. It's also important to make a distinction, however, between ethnic group and ethnicity. Ethnicity has to do with one's psychological identification with the group. So thus, a particular individual may be black in terms of the ethnic group to which he or she is a member, but that individual's psychological identification with that group may vary from 0 to 100. In fact, some blacks are so non-black, I call them Afro-Saxons. And you can find similar kinds of individuals within other ethnic groups. So it seems to me that ethnic studies is the study of all of us, but we should keep in mind that people embrace ethnicity and ethnic identification to various levels and extents. Another pervasive belief I have found about ethnic studies among educators, and that is that ethnic studies is for ethnic minorities. This is I find very frequently. I ask teachers, what do you teach about the Japanese-American internment of World War II? What do you teach about the anti-Filipino riots of the 20s? What do you teach about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? And they say, we don't teach anything, Jim, because we don't have any Japanese in our classes. We just don't have any of them, so how can we teach about them? So I ask them, what do you teach about classical Rome and Greece? What do you teach about medieval Europe? And what do you teach about the Renaissance? And they say, we have excellent units on those topics. So I say you don't have to have some to teach about them. It seems to me that there are some concepts, some content to which all of our students should be exposed, regardless of their ethnicity and regardless of whether they live in the barrios in New York City or whether they live in the inner city areas or in the suburban areas of Ames. Another widespread conception of ethnic studies that I have found is that many people believe that it is in addition to the curriculum, that all you need to do is to add Marian Anderson and George Washington Carver to Betsy Ross and Abraham Lincoln, and we have ethnic studies just add on a little bit. What are the problems with this? It seems to me that we need drastic and radical modification of the total curriculum in all content areas. And we should not just add on to a curriculum that is already chronically suffering from an overload of facts and historically insignificant events and heroes. Bunny Smith, who you may know as B. Othaniel Smith, made a very perceptive statement the summer that I had the opportunity to work with him. And Bunny said, and I quote, that the history of education could be written as the power of unexamined ideas, end of quote. And it seems to me that educators respond to any social crisis by adding on something to the curriculum. It is overloaded already with drug studies, law focused education, and sex education. It seems to me that we can't just add on. My question, if we keep adding on as a strategy, is how much can a curriculum tolerate, ladies and gentlemen, before it explodes? Clearly, it seems to me that we need an alternative approach to curriculum development. The additive approach is grossly insufficient. Modifying the school curriculum to include ethnic content and indeed career education materials and other reforms to which we all are concerned provides a tremendous opportunity to re-examine the assumptions, the purposes, and the nature of the curriculum, and to formulate a new curriculum with new assumptions and new goals. There's a fourth notion of ethnic studies, a misconception that I find, and that is what I call the TP and Chitling approach to ethnic studies. Many school districts that I go into, especially in the lower grades, kids are building teepees and eating soul food and building igloos and eating chow mein and tacos. And the teachers say, we are having ethnic studies. Now, what's wrong with the TP and Chitling approach? It seems to me that this approach runs the risk of reinforcing stereotypes and misconceptions. That the students are likely to say, those folks sure are strange for eating hog intestines. Chitling, those of you who didn't know that, they're really delicious. I should, if you get used to them. Now, it seems to me that the TP and Chitling approach has a number of problems, the problem of reinforcing misconceptions. It's like the teachers, many teachers I know in ethnic studies, the first thing they want to do is to take I call it the zoo approach to ethnic studies, is to take their kids down to Chinatown for a field trip. Before the students have had any opportunity to understand Chinatown as a cultural expression. And I'm very opposed to the zoo approach, especially when it's used initially with kids' multi-ethnic experiences. But it's a favorite one of teachers across this land, and indeed across North America. It seems to me that a major goal of multi-ethnic education is to help students to gain better self-understanding by viewing themselves from the perspectives of another culture. Just as the fish is unable to appreciate the uniqueness of his aquatic environment, so are many Anglo-American children unable to fully see and appreciate the uniqueness of their cultural characteristics. Writes Kluckholm, the anthropologist, and I quote, "Cultural studies holds up a great mirror to man and lets him look at himself in his infinite variety," end of quote. Another major goal of multi-ethnic education is to help students to develop cross-cultural competency. And by this I mean the ability and the skills and the knowledge to function efficaciously within their own ethnic culture, within the mainstream culture, as well as within and across cultures. Edward T. Hall, the brilliant researcher formerly of Northwestern, writes in his new book called Beyond Culture, and I quote, "The future depends on man's transcending the limits of individual cultures," end of quote. I'm going to quote that again because I think it gets at the crux of what I'm suggesting tonight. Hall writes that the future depends on man's transcending the limits of individual cultures, end of quote. And it seems to me he's saying that if we are to survive in this increasingly shrinking world, if we are to be efficacious in a world society of the present and future, that we must develop the ability to break down ethnic encapsulation and to reach beyond the boundaries of our own cultural limitations. It seems to me that rather than focusing on teepees and tacos and chitlins, that the curriculum should help students understand basic values of ethnic minorities, their basic cultures. And I'd like to give an example of one such value, and it has to do with how the Native Americans originally saw their relationship with the earth in the universe. Indian groups tended to look upon the universe as a whole, with every object having a sacred life. To separate humans from nature was antithetical to the Great Spirit, for to the Great Spirit all was life. The Native American felt that they existed in unity and in harmony with nature. Many centuries ago, a white buffalo woman gave to the Sioux people a sacred pipe in a small round stone. She said, in part, and I quote, "With this pipe you will walk upon the earth, for the earth is your grandmother and mother, and she is sacred. Every step that is taken upon her should be as a prayer. The bowl of this pipe is of red stone. It is the earth. Carved in the stone and facing the center is this buffalo calf who represents all the four-leggeds who live upon your mother. The stem of the pipe is of wood, and this represents all that grows upon the earth. All these peoples and all the things of the universe are joined to you who smoke the pipe. All send their voices to the Great Spirit," end of quote. And note that in this quote, we see the Native American traditional values toward the earth and the land. One of the reasons for the great conflict that developed between European immigrants and Native Americans was the different worldviews that they had in their relationship with the earth. The Indians felt that you could buy and sell the land, no more than you could buy and sell the air or the sea. The Europeans, because of their cultural experiences, believed that you could buy and sell land, and hence the conflict. Many times when Indians signed treaties, they did not realize that they were giving up their rights to use the land, but they thought merely that they were extending the opportunities for the European immigrants to share the land. Another value within an ethnic community is highlighted within this poem that was penned by Langston Hughes, the gifted Harlem Renaissance poet of the 20s. It's called Mother to Son, and Hughes writes, "Well, son, I tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor bare. But all the time I've been climbing on and reaching landings and turning in a system of harsh discrimination." There's another approach to ethnic studies, and I call it the heroes and holidays approach. In many school districts I go in, the people are celebrating Black Day, Indian Week, Jewish morning, Italian afternoon, and so forth. And they say, we are doing ethnic studies. In one school, a young child came home and the parent asked the typical question, "What happened at school today?" And the kid said, "That was a dragon running through the school." And the parent said, "What? A dragon?" And it scared the child to wits. And so the parents went to the school to inquire about what happened, and the school was having Chinese New Year celebration. It was the year of the dragon. And regardless of what the school intended to teach, what they had taught the child was fear of dragons. It seems to me that the long-range effects of Black Day, Indian morning, and Chicano afternoon, that the long-range effect of these kind of celebrations, if they are not integral parts of the total school program, is that they might reinforce the notion that ethnic groups are not integral parts of American history and culture. Every day in the classroom ought to be Black Day, Chicano Day, Italian Day, and Jewish American Day. The curriculum should be conceptual, and components of these ethnic cultures should be used as examples of key concepts, such as culture and socialization, whenever appropriate within the curriculum. Otherwise, students might conclude that American history and that Black history or Chicano history are distinctly separate and mutually exclusive entities from American history. I have argued what ethnic studies should not be. What should it be? Ethnic studies should be viewed as a process of curriculum reform that will result in the creation of a new curriculum that is based on new assumptions and new perspectives, and which will help students to gain novel views of the American experience and a new conception of what it means to be an American. Could I have overhead 4, please? In this diagram, I have tried to, 4, I may have it misnumbered. In this diagram, I have tried to indicate what I call 4 models, which describe some things that are happening in ethnic studies. And I have described ethnic studies as a process of curriculum reform. In Model A, I call it the Anglo-American centric model, and that's the model to your extreme left. In this model, it shows that that the Anglo-American perspective is at the center of the curriculum, and this is what is taught, and this is primarily all that is taught. What are some examples of an Anglo-American perspective on an event? Let's take the Japanese-American internment of World War II. One interpretation of that's traditional and Anglo-centric is that the Japanese-American were interned because they were a risk to national security. That is a traditional interpretation. We now know that there are other legitimate ways of viewing that conflict. Roger Daniels, in his classic book, Concentration Camps USA, suggests documents that tells us that this was primarily a political decision and not an economic, and not a military decision. We knew that the Japanese at the time were not a security risk. By we, I mean the higher officials. And they were interned primarily because they were a competition for the agribusiness persons of California, and they wanted to get rid of them as a source of competition. Okay, many school districts have moved from a Model A to a Model B curriculum. Note that in that model, the Anglo-American perspective is still at the center of the curriculum, but we have added on black units and Native American units, units on on Chicanos and so forth. But note that the curriculum still remains primarily Anglo-American centric. I'm suggesting that we move to Model C. Note that in that model, the social or historical event or concept is at the center of the model and not the Anglo-American perspective. That event is looked at from several ethnic perspectives, including the Anglo-American perspective. May I have the number 5, please? Because we live in a world society, it is also necessary to help students to view at least some issues from the points of view of ethnic groups that lives in other nations. And it seems to me that we could, for example, look at the issue of separatism, assuming that separatism was at the center of the circle. And let's look at Canada. We could at least perhaps look at that issue from the perspectives of Anglo-Canadians and French Canadians. Okay, you can kill the overhead. I am not suggesting that we eliminate Anglo-American history or Anglo perspectives on historical issues. I am merely suggesting that Anglo-American perspectives should be one among many different ethnic perspectives that are taught in the school. It seems to me that only in this way will students get a global rather than an ethnocentric view of our nation's history and culture. And only in this way, it seems to me, will we help students to break out of their ethnic encapsulations. It seems to me that to attain social and economic mobility, many ethnic minorities are forced out of their ethnic enclaves, and they become bi-ethnic or bicultural. However, many Anglo-American youth remain within their ethnic enclaves from birth until death. The school should help all students to broaden their cultural and ethnic perspectives and to learn other ways of being and of living. We do students a tremendous disservice when we only teach them aspects and extensions of their own cultures. The schools should present all students from all cultural and ethnic groups with cultural and ethnic alternatives. And this is the key to me to multi-ethnic education. Implementing sound multi-ethnic and multinational curriculum models and programs will be an exceedingly difficult task in the years ahead. School district budgets are being drastically cut, and human relations is often viewed as a frill. as the Back to Basics movement escalates throughout the nation and throughout North America. However, it seems to me that we should move forward to basics, and developing cross-cultural competency is a basic skill in our increasingly shrinking and predominantly non-white world of the present and future. It seems to me that many groups will oppose multi-ethnic educational reform. However, these groups must be adamantly resisted by educators with vision, courage, and commitment. The challenge is Herculean. The odds are against us. The hour is late. However, what is at stake is priceless: the liberation of the hearts and mind of all American youth. Thus, we must, like Don Quixote, dream the impossible dream, reach for the unreachable star, and act decisively to right the unrightable wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. One thing I failed to mention, if you want to have a little more of Jim, the PDK commercial. Multi-ethnic education, practices and promises. Fastback number 87. It's probably in some of your school buildings or at the university that you're possibly associated with or near. I'd like to thank you all tonight for coming. In particular, I'd like to thank you, Jim, for your fine address. I would encourage those of you who are in the audience to capture Jim for a moment or two, if you are inclined to do so. He's kind of stuck here till tomorrow morning when he and I will be leaving early when it's dark out for Des Moines. No, we don't say that. I have a couple of little announcements to make, to take care of a few items. My old friend, Betty Atwood, room 219. Betty is hosting a party. No, Betty is hosting the IASCD board meeting right after this meeting. And if you have a ticket for this banquet, place it on the table before you leave. We thank you all for coming. If you want to know anything about Ames, Iowa, and all the wonderful things that you can do after leaving this banquet, I suggest you contact either Luke Kaiser or Don Carlson or Ralph Farrar. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy your stay here.